The bet. The opulence of the grand ballroom in William Clark's estate seemed to stretch on infinitely. Crystal chandeliers, each one crafted with painstaking detail, hung from the high ceilings, casting a golden glow across the room. Their light glistened off the polished marble floors, where men in sharp tuxedos and women in elegant gowns mingled and laughed. The air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne, rare cigars, and a fragrance of power that seemed to seep into the very walls of the room. This wasn't just any event, it was the type of gala where only the most powerful, wealthy, and influential gathered, and every corner of the room whispered of privilege. Standing tall and imposing at the heart of it all was William Clark, heir to a sprawling financial empire that stretched across the nation. At 6 feet 3 inches, with broad shoulders and sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce through the room, he was a man used to having his way in everything. His jaw was set with quiet confidence, and his posture alone demanded respect. William was accustomed to admiration, people in the room sought his approval, his partnership, his attention. To those who had never met him, he was the very image of success, and to those who had, he was a reminder of the consequences of failing to meet expectations. He surveyed the room with a cool detachment, a man in control of everything around him. His gaze swept past the crowd of associates and friends, stopping briefly at his longtime rival and occasional confidant, Harrison Banks. Harrison had been part of William's inner circle for years, yet the two were anything but friendly at all times. Harrison was sharp-witted, always ready to push boundaries and challenge William, if only to amuse himself. Tonight, however, his expression held a glint of mischief, as though he had something planned. "William," Harrison said, strolling toward him with his usual confident swagger, the glass of wine in his hand glinting under the chandelier's light. "I've been thinking. You always seem to know how to get everything you want, don't you?" William's lips curled into a slight smile. He was used to Harrison's games, the way the man would needle him just to see what reaction he could provoke. "What's on your mind, Harrison?" Harrison glanced over at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests, before turning back to William. "I'm curious. Have you ever really lost at anything? I mean, in all your years, has there ever been a challenge that really threw you off course?" William's smile faded slightly. It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence born from experience. "I don't lose." Harrison chuckled, the sound rich with humor and something else, something like a challenge. "That's what I thought. You know, I've heard an interesting rumor. There's a maid on your estate. A woman with, let's say, no business being part of this world." His voice dropped a little, giving his words the weight of something scandalous. William raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity surfacing. A maid? He couldn't remember the last time he had even paid attention to one of the staff members, let alone considered them a topic for conversation. "Oh, yes," Harrison continued, his tone mocking but still edged with intrigue. "A maid, right under your nose. I'm sure you've noticed her. Emily Thompson, I believe her name is. Quiet, unassuming, doesn't seem like she belongs in a place like this. But here's the twist, I bet you wouldn't dare marry her." The statement hung in the air like a dare, a challenge that stirred something deep within William. His life had been one of calculated moves, strategy, and success. The idea that anyone, especially someone in her station, could challenge him was, frankly, absurd. And yet, Harrison's words gnawed at him in a way he hadn't expected. It was the type of bet that would have been laughable if it weren't so personally provoking. "You're saying I couldn't marry her?" William's voice was low, his curiosity piqued by the absurdity of the idea. Harrison's eyes twinkled. "Exactly. A woman who has no social standing, no wealth, no connections. Just a servant. And you, William Clark, the untouchable heir. You wouldn't deign to marry someone like that. You wouldn't lower yourself, would you?" William's first instinct was to laugh it off. It was an idiotic challenge. But then he considered it. He could already picture the look on Harrison's face when he made her an offer, something so absurd, so beneath him, that she'd reject it instantly. It would be the perfect way to shut Harrison up. "I'll take your bet," William said, his voice smooth and confident. "I'll marry this maid of yours. And when I do, I'll make sure you're the one eating your words." Harrison's lips curled into a sly grin. "You have no idea what you're getting into, William. This one will not go the way you think." The terms of the bet were set. William didn't think twice. He had been in control of everything for so long that the mere thought of losing to someone like Emily Thompson, a woman of little to no significance, was laughable. She was an easy target, a pawn in a game that he had already won in his mind. But as the days passed, William couldn't help but be drawn to the idea of this maid. He watched her from afar, observing her movements around the estate. Emily was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. While she was indeed quiet and humble, there was an undeniable strength to her, an inner resolve that seemed to radiate from within. Despite her position, she carried herself with a dignity that was impossible to ignore. She never sought attention. She didn't play the part of the subservient, meek servant that people like William expected. Instead, she did her job with efficiency and grace, and William found himself intrigued by her lack of fear. Most women who worked in his presence were either intimidated by him or desperate for his attention, but not Emily. She simply existed. And that fact rattled him in ways he didn't fully understand. One evening, William decided to make his move. He found her alone in the garden, the moonlight casting a soft glow on her features. She was trimming the roses, her movements careful and precise. He approached, his footsteps silent on the grass. "Miss Thompson," he called, his voice low but firm. She turned, her expression neutral, as if she had been expecting him. "Mr. Clark," she replied, her tone polite but unflinching. "I've been thinking," he began, watching her closely. "About that bet." Emily didn't flinch. She didn't seem startled by his sudden appearance or his words. Her gaze met his with quiet composure, a faint but knowing look in her eyes. "I've decided to take you up on your offer," he said, stepping closer, his voice smooth. "I'll marry you. I'll make you my wife, if that's what you want." Her eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained calm. "And if I refuse?" William smiled, his pride swelling at the thought of her refusal. "You won't refuse. No one does when I offer them a chance at this kind of life." There was a pause, a quiet moment where the air seemed to thicken. Emily didn't speak immediately. She stood still, as if considering his offer carefully. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Yes." William froze. The word lingered in the air, hanging between them like an unexpected storm. He had expected her to hesitate, to balk, to challenge him in some way. Instead, she had agreed without a moment's hesitation. For the first time, William wasn't entirely sure what to do next. The unexpected agreement. William stood there for a long moment, staring at Emily as if she had just revealed some hidden truth he couldn't yet decipher. The moonlight bathed her in a soft, ethereal glow, making her appear almost untouchable. Her answer, simple and succinct, had caught him completely off guard. He had expected hesitation, maybe even defiance, something that would prove he still held the power in this strange little game they were playing. But instead, she had agreed. And in that instant, William realized he had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. Emily's gaze remained steady as she held his stare. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way she stood, tall and composed, the slight curve of her lips that suggested she wasn't as surprised by the offer as he was. In that quiet moment, William could almost see the gears turning in her mind, as if she were evaluating him, this strange offer, and whatever else might lay hidden behind it. He blinked first, the silence between them stretching just a little too long for comfort. "You'll marry me?" William's voice was barely a whisper, as though he couldn't quite believe the words coming out of his mouth. The challenge was meant to be simple, nothing more than a game to him, a way to shut Harrison's taunting grin down for good. But now, standing here, with Emily so calm and composed, he was beginning to wonder if he had underestimated this woman in ways he hadn't considered before. "Yes," Emily replied again, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the tension that had settled between them. "I will marry you. If you truly wish it." Her words were so direct, so unflinchingly certain, that William almost felt a wave of respect for her. There was no begging, no pleading, no nervous shifting from foot to foot. She had simply accepted, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was unsettling. William stepped back, running a hand through his dark hair, trying to regain his bearings. His initial confidence was beginning to waver, though he refused to show it. He was a man who always had control, and right now, he was starting to lose it. The bet had been so trivial in his mind, just another win in his endless string of victories. But this unexpected turn of events, was something he hadn't anticipated. Emily was no pawn to be moved easily. There was depth to her that he hadn't noticed before. He cleared his throat and straightened his posture, trying to maintain the facade of the powerful, unflappable man everyone expected him to be. "We'll set the wedding for next month," he said, his voice steady, though there was a new edge to it now. "That will give us enough time to inform the necessary people. Your family. I trust they'll be thrilled." Emily's expression didn't change, but the subtle tightening of her jaw told William everything he needed to know. "I have no family, Mr. Clark," she said simply, her tone almost matter-of-fact. "Just me. I'll be enough." For a brief moment, William felt a pang of something he couldn't quite place. Guilt? Regret? He had assumed that Emily's life was nothing but a simple, ordinary existence, one that could be swept up in the grandeur of his world with a single gesture. But now, he was faced with the weight of her words. She wasn't a woman desperate for an escape. She wasn't a servant begging for a life of luxury. She was something else entirely. And that realization sent an uncomfortable ripple through him. But he refused to dwell on it. William Clark didn't deal in emotions. He dealt in power, influence, and, most importantly, control. And no matter what, he would regain control of this situation. "We'll see," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He turned on his heel and walked away without another word, his mind spinning with the possibilities of what this marriage would mean. On the surface, it was a joke, nothing more than a bet. But beneath that, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Emily Thompson might just be the one to challenge him in ways he couldn't anticipate. The following weeks passed by in a blur of activity, but it was a kind of activity that William had grown accustomed to. Everything had to be perfect. The wedding, despite its unusual origin, was no exception. Invitations were sent out, catering and flowers were arranged, and the entire estate was transformed into a palace fit for royalty. The media buzzed with rumors of his impending marriage, and the news spread like wildfire. His friends and colleagues all had their opinions, most of them skeptical but intrigued by his decision to marry Emily. No one understood why he was doing it, not even Harrison, who had, after all, initiated the whole thing. "I thought you were just playing with her," Harrison said one evening as the two sat in the grand study, sipping whiskey and discussing business. "What's with this wedding nonsense? You're really going through with it?" William paused, swirling his drink as he stared into the amber liquid, trying to come up with an answer that wouldn't reveal the growing unease inside him. "It's just a game, Harrison. Nothing more. She'll be nothing more than a footnote in my life." Harrison smirked, but there was something dark in his eyes. "Don't fool yourself, William. You're about to tie yourself to someone who could bring down everything you've built. She's no pawn. I'm not saying she'll do it, but there's a certain unpredictability about her. Don't say I didn't warn you." William waved him off, unwilling to acknowledge the creeping doubts that had begun to form. He had everything under control. He was William Clark, nothing ever slipped from his grasp. The night of the wedding arrived with the same splendor that had marked every other event at Clark's estate. The ballroom gleamed under the lights, the scent of fresh roses and candle wax filled the air, and the guests filed in with their polished smiles and extravagant gowns. But amidst the sea of glittering faces, there was one that caught the attention of everyone who dared to look. Emily Thompson. She entered the room quietly, but the moment she stepped through the double doors, a hushed silence fell over the crowd. Her gown, a simple yet stunning creation of white silk, clung to her frame in a way that suggested elegance without being ostentatious. The veil that covered her face only added to the mystery, making her seem almost otherworldly. Her expression was calm, her steps measured, and yet there was something undeniable in the air, the power she had over this moment. William stood at the altar, his back straight and his jaw clenched, watching her every move. He had anticipated this moment with a mixture of arrogance and amusement, but now that it was finally here, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. As she reached him, Emily's eyes met his, and for the first time, William saw something he hadn't expected, something that made his chest tighten uncomfortably. There was no fear in her gaze. No hesitation. She wasn't looking at him with awe, as women often did when they found themselves in his presence. She was simply present. As if she belonged there just as much as he did. The officiant spoke, and the ceremony began. The words of the vows, the exchange of rings, the sealing of the deal, it all passed by in a blur to William. His mind was elsewhere, distracted by thoughts of Emily's calm composure, her quiet strength. This wasn't supposed to be a meaningful event. It was a bet. A joke. But somehow, in the middle of the vows, William realized that this wasn't just a game anymore. Something had changed. Something he couldn't quite grasp. Emily stood there, silently repeating the vows, her voice soft but unwavering. When it came time for him to speak, William found himself struggling to get the words out. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure of himself. And in that moment, a seed of doubt was planted in his mind. Could this really be the beginning of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined, the wedding night? The grand ballroom had emptied, the guests long gone, leaving behind only the quiet echoes of their laughter and the fading scent of champagne. The estate was eerily still, bathed in moonlight that streamed through the tall windows. It felt as though time itself had slowed, holding its breath for what was to come next. William Clark stood alone in the vast, opulent foyer of his home, his tuxedo slightly disheveled, his mind racing. It was a night he had been anticipating for weeks, a night he believed would be just another victory to add to his endless list of triumphs. But now, as he waited for Emily to join him, he found himself unable to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the pit of his stomach. When he had first proposed this marriage, it had all been a game, a challenge he knew he would win with ease. A beautiful woman with no connections, no family, no wealth, she had been a perfect pawn. He had convinced himself that this would be another trophy to showcase, a small, inconsequential detail in his grand life. He would marry Emily, and in doing so, prove to Harrison and everyone else that he could have anything he wanted. But something about her had unsettled him since that first night when she had agreed to his proposal with such calm certainty. Her poise, her quiet strength, the way she had carried herself during the wedding, everything about her felt different from the women he usually entertained. And now, as he stood waiting for her in the emptiness of the estate, he couldn't deny the growing sense of doubt that clouded his thoughts. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. William turned, his breath catching in his throat when he saw her. Emily, standing in the doorway, bathed in the soft light of the hallway. The veil had been removed, her long, dark hair cascading down her back in waves. She was still wearing the wedding gown, but now, without the veil, she looked even more striking. There was an air of quiet confidence about her, something that felt different from the woman he had married earlier that day. "Emily," he said, his voice hoarse, betraying the unease that he couldn't quite conceal. "I didn't expect you to still be wearing the gown." "I thought it was the right thing to do," she replied softly, stepping into the room. Her gaze never wavered from his, but there was no warmth in her eyes, only a kind of detached understanding, as if she were assessing him, measuring the distance between them. William could feel the weight of her stare, and for a moment, he wasn't sure whether he was the one who should be in control of this situation. He quickly pushed the thought aside, straightening himself up and walking toward her with deliberate steps. This was his home, his world. He had invited her into it, and tonight was supposed to prove that he still held the reins, no matter what game they were playing. But Emily wasn't the woman he had thought she would be. As he reached her, William hesitated for a moment. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, almost as though something was about to crack open between them. But instead of addressing it directly, he chose to move forward with what he knew, what he had always known. He took a step closer, extending his hand in the traditional gesture. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost detached. It was a gesture meant to break the awkwardness of the moment, to return to the routine that had defined his life. The wedding night, the consummation of the marriage, was a simple formality, a step he had always taken with any woman who had shared his bed. Emily didn't take his hand. Instead, she met his gaze with a cool, composed look. "You don't have to do this, William." Her words were a quiet challenge, but they struck him like a slap. He frowned, unsure whether she was being serious or playful. Either way, it irritated him. This wasn't the kind of woman he was used to, one who would accept his control without question, who would be grateful for his attention. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, forcing his tone to remain even, though there was a flicker of frustration in his voice. He had been married for a matter of hours, and already, Emily seemed to be unraveling the very fabric of his authority. "I mean, you don't have to pretend," Emily replied, her voice steady, but with an edge that hinted at something deeper. "I don't need the charade, William. I'm not here to play games with you." Her words hung in the air between them, unspoken truths swirling just below the surface. It was clear that she was not going to be another trophy wife, a woman to be paraded around like one of his many possessions. And yet, that was precisely what William had expected her to be. He hadn't prepared for someone who would call him out on his facade, who would see through the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. William stood there, feeling a strange combination of irritation and admiration toward Emily. He didn't like the way she was challenging him, but at the same time, there was something magnetic about her, a quiet strength that he hadn't seen in anyone else. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low. "I don't have time for games, Emily. You've agreed to this marriage, and we both know what comes next." "Do we?" she asked, her tone cool and calculated. "Do you really think you can control me with your wealth, your power? Because if that's the case, William, you've underestimated me." William blinked, thrown off balance by her response. He had assumed that his wealth and influence would be enough to secure her compliance. That was how it always worked. But Emily wasn't like the women he usually dealt with. She wasn't swayed by his money, his status, or the things he could provide for her. There was something far more complex about her. Something that intrigued him even as it unsettled him. "Why did you agree to this then?" William demanded, his voice edging toward frustration. "Why marry me if you don't need what I can offer you?" Emily took a step closer to him, her eyes unwavering. "Because I wanted to show you that you don't have the power over me that you think you do. You're a man used to getting everything you want, William. But I'm not like the others. I'm not a prize to be won." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always been the one in control, the one pulling the strings, and yet here was this woman, this servant girl, standing before him, challenging everything he thought he knew about power, control, and relationships. He couldn't help but feel a strange mix of admiration and frustration. "I didn't marry you to lose control, Emily," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You never had control over me to begin with," she replied, her voice soft but firm. And in that moment, as they stood in the grand silence of the estate, something between them shifted. Emily was no longer just the woman he had won in a bet. She was something far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more fascinating than he had ever anticipated. For the first time, William realized that this marriage, this game, might not be as easy to win as he had believed. And the realization made his heart race in a way he hadn't expected. The unraveling. The following weeks passed in a blur of public appearances, lavish dinners, and extravagant charity events. On the outside, William Clark and Emily Clark presented the perfect power couple, two figures of wealth, grace, and influence, fitting seamlessly into the high society world they both inhabited. Their public image was flawless, meticulously curated by William's team of public relations experts, and Emily played her role as the poised, elegant wife with surprising ease. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was different. William had quickly learned that Emily wasn't the compliant, docile woman he had expected. In fact, she was nothing like he had imagined. Their marriage, which had begun as a way for him to prove a point, had begun to feel increasingly alien to him. The days were filled with business meetings and social obligations, but it was the nights that troubled William. Emily was no longer the quiet, subservient figure he had thought she would be. She was a mystery, a presence that both fascinated and frustrated him in equal measure. She refused to simply blend into the background, and that, in itself, made her dangerous in his eyes. It wasn't that she was overtly rebellious, but her subtle defiance, her refusal to be reduced to the role of a trophy wife, was something he couldn't quite control. She questioned him, challenged his assumptions, and made him confront the parts of himself that he had always kept buried. They didn't argue in the way he had expected. There were no loud fights or dramatic confrontations. Instead, their disagreements were quieter, more insidious. Emily would make a remark about his business practices, or comment on his relationships with his associates, or question the very foundations of the life he had built. William would brush off the comments at first, dismissing them as nothing more than the musings of a woman who didn't understand the intricacies of running an empire. But the more he thought about her words, the more he realized that there was truth in them, a truth he wasn't ready to face. It wasn't just the marriage that was uncomfortable, it was the way Emily seemed to see him. It was as if she looked through him, past the wealth and the success, to the man beneath. She didn't admire him the way others did, she didn't worship his power. She seemed to be appraising him, questioning his every move, every decision. And William hated it. One evening, after a particularly grueling board meeting where he had been forced to defend his latest business acquisition, William returned to the estate to find Emily in the sitting room, sitting by the fire, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Her posture was impeccable, as always, but there was something about her demeanor that made him pause. She wasn't reading a book or drinking wine as she usually did after his long days, she was waiting for him, her eyes fixed on the flames, as though she were deep in thought. "Good evening, Emily," he said, his voice curt as he entered the room, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head to face him, her gaze piercing. There was something in her eyes that made William pause, something that felt like a challenge, a silent invitation for him to confront whatever unspoken tension had been building between them. "William," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We need to talk." Her words sent a ripple of unease through him. He had been expecting a quiet evening to himself, the comfort of solitude after a taxing day. But it seemed that Emily had other plans. He crossed the room, taking a seat across from her. "About what?" She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his mood. "About us. About this marriage." William's jaw clenched. He had been dreading this conversation, but he had known it was inevitable. He had tried to bury it beneath his work, his obligations, his need to maintain the facade of the perfect marriage. But Emily wasn't going to let it slide. "I don't know what you want me to say, Emily," he said, his voice strained. "You knew exactly what this was when we agreed to this marriage. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Is that really all it is to you?" she asked, her voice quiet but cutting. "A business arrangement?" William leaned forward, his frustration starting to bubble to the surface. What else would it be? He gestured to the room around them, the wealth, the luxury, the empire he had built. "I gave you a life you could only dream of. This is the world you wanted, isn't it?" "I never asked for any of this," she said, her voice calm, almost disinterested. "You gave me this life, yes. But not because you wanted to, because you made a bet." William's eyes flashed with irritation. "That was before, Emily. Before you agreed to marry me. That's over now. We're past it." "No," she said, shaking her head slowly. "We're not past it. You think because you've given me everything I could ever want, that I should be grateful, that I should accept whatever role you've decided for me. But that's not how this works." A sudden silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. William opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions, the one who defined the terms of every relationship. But here, in this room, with Emily's unwavering gaze fixed on him, he began to feel a shift he couldn't quite understand. "Why are you fighting me on this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm not just some woman you can control," Emily replied, her voice steady. "I'm not just a prize to be won. You may have thought you could win me with your wealth and your power, but I'm not like the women you're used to." "Then why did you marry me?" William demanded, his frustration growing. "If you're so independent, so capable, why did you accept my offer?" Emily stood, her face calm, her expression unreadable. "I married you, William, because I wanted to show you that you can't control everything. Not everyone can be bought. And not everyone can be kept in your cage." She turned and walked toward the door, her movements graceful and deliberate, as though she had already decided the conversation was over. William remained seated, his chest tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. As she left the room, William was left alone with the flickering fire and the realization that Emily had done something no one had ever done to him before. She had made him question himself, his choices, and his life. And for the first time in years, he didn't have the answers. The reckoning. The days that followed were a turbulent blur for William. The lavish balls, the high-powered meetings, and the relentless stream of social events seemed to have lost their meaning. His mind often wandered back to that night in the sitting room, to Emily's words that had pierced his defenses more deeply than he cared to admit. He had always been in control, always the master of his domain, but now, for the first time, he found himself questioning the very foundation of his life. He had always considered himself a man who understood power, who could bend people to his will with a look, a gesture, or a well-timed word. But Emily wasn't like anyone he had encountered before. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, his title, or his dominance. If anything, it seemed as though she was quietly dismantling every aspect of his carefully constructed life, piece by piece. The more William tried to ignore it, the more her words reverberated in his mind. He had built his empire on control, on the belief that if he could just accumulate enough wealth, enough power, he could have everything he wanted. But Emily's refusal to conform to the role he had assigned her was making him realize how fragile that control really was. William tried to focus on work, on his business empire that had brought him so much success. But the more he threw himself into his empire, the more disconnected he felt from the world around him. His mind kept drifting back to Emily, to the woman who had entered his life as part of a bet and had become the catalyst for his greatest personal reckoning. It was a quiet morning when the situation reached a breaking point. William had just returned from a meeting with his top executives, a meeting that had left him more frustrated than ever. He walked through the grand halls of the Clark estate, his footsteps echoing on the polished floors. The house, once a symbol of his success, now felt hollow, empty, a gilded cage. He made his way to his study, hoping to escape into the solitude of paperwork and numbers. But as he entered the study, he was met with an unexpected sight. Emily stood by the window, staring out over the sprawling grounds, her silhouette framed by the soft light of the morning sun. For a moment, she seemed to be lost in thought, her expression unreadable. "Emily," William said, his voice sharp. "We need to talk." She turned slowly to face him, her eyes calm but distant. There was no trace of surprise in her demeanor, as though she had been expecting this moment for some time. "You've been avoiding me," she said, her tone almost too calm. "Why?" William's jaw tightened, and he took a few steps toward her. "Avoiding you? I've been busy." "You've been avoiding the truth," Emily replied, her voice unwavering. "The truth about us. The truth about what this marriage really is." William stopped in his tracks. It was the same thing she had said before, the same words that had unsettled him in the sitting room. It felt as though she could see right through him, to the parts of himself that he had never allowed anyone to see. And that terrified him. "Do you really believe that this marriage was only about a bet?" William asked, his voice tight. "Because if you do, then you're mistaken. I didn't marry you because I thought it would be a game. I married you because you're different. You challenge me." Emily's eyes flickered with something akin to surprise, but she quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "I don't want to be your challenge, William. I don't want to be something for you to conquer." William took a step closer, his voice growing more intense. "But you are. You've forced me to question everything. You've made me realize that I've been living in a world where I control everything, where nothing surprises me. But you're the one thing I can't control. And that scares me." For the first time in their marriage, Emily's composure faltered. Her gaze softened, and for a brief moment, William saw a flicker of something he hadn't expected: vulnerability. "You don't have to control everything, William," Emily said, her voice softer now. "You don't have to control me. But you do have to face who you really are." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. William felt as though he were standing on the edge of something, teetering on the brink of a precipice. He had spent his entire life building walls, protecting himself from the pain of vulnerability, from the fear of being seen for who he truly was. But Emily had torn down those walls, one word at a time. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say to someone who had so completely upended his understanding of himself. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, of decisiveness. But here, in this moment, with Emily standing before him, he felt paralyzed. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to fix us." Emily took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. "Maybe you don't need to fix it," she said. "Maybe you just need to be honest with yourself. And with me." For the first time in a long while, William felt the weight of his own emotions. He had spent so many years burying his feelings, focusing solely on his empire and his success. But now, with Emily's gentle insistence, he was being forced to confront the emptiness that had lingered beneath the surface of his carefully curated life. "Why did you agree to marry me?" he asked suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "If you knew what this was, if you knew I was only doing it to prove a point, why did you agree?" Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face as though weighing his sincerity. "Because I believed in something more than just the bet, William. I believed that you could change. That you could see beyond your empire and your wealth and understand that there's more to life than winning. William swallowed hard. For the first time, he realized that Emily wasn't just challenging him, she was showing him a path he had never considered, one that led away from his obsession with control and power. "I don't know if I can change," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "You don't have to change all at once," Emily replied. "But you do have to choose who you want to be. And who you want to be with." The weight of her words settled heavily on William's shoulders. He had spent his life building an empire, but now he realized that the empire he had built, his wealth, his power, his control, was nothing more than a facade. The real question was not whether he could continue to win, but whether he could let go of the things that had defined him for so long. As he looked into Emily's eyes, William knew that he stood at a crossroads. The choices he made in the coming days would define not just his marriage, but his entire life.